I felt it was a relatively difficult jigsaw puzzle. I felt it was a relatively difficult jigsaw puzzle. She speaks relatively quickly. She speaks relatively quickly. Currency and bond markets are relatively calm. Currency and bond markets are relatively calm. Buildings of national importance are relatively safe. Buildings of national importance are relatively safe. That area is relatively rich in natural resources. That area is relatively rich in natural resources. The province is relatively rich in mineral resources. The province is relatively rich in mineral resources. The computer is a relatively recent invention. The computer is a relatively recent invention. This hotel is relatively expensive for this town. This hotel is relatively expensive for this town. Milk has to be kept at a relatively low temperature. Milk has to be kept at a relatively low temperature. The sales floor was relatively uncrowded. The sales floor was relatively uncrowded. That is relatively a little high. That is relatively a little high. This winter is relatively mild. This winter is relatively mild. My car gets relatively poor mileage. My car gets relatively poor mileage. It was hot today, but it was relatively dry. It was hot today, but it was relatively dry. I am solving starting with the relatively easy problems. I am solving starting with the relatively easy problems. I was able to write a relatively long report. I was able to write a relatively long report. The metals fused at a relatively low temperature. The metals fused at a relatively low temperature.